Conversing is produced and distributed in partnership with Comet Magazine and Fuller Seminary. I'm Mark Labberton. Welcome to Conversing. What a gift it is today to have Christian Wiman as our guest on Conversing. Christian is the author, editor, and translator of more than 14 books, which include titles such as Zero at the Bone, 50 Entries Against Despair, My Bright Abyss, Meditation of a Modern Believer, and most recently, Glimmerings, Letters on Faith Between a Poet and a Theologian, co-written with Miroslav Volf. He is a remarkable influence on the lives of many people, in part because of his candor in telling us the story and the experience of a terminal cancer diagnosis. As Marilyn Robinson puts it, Christian's poetry and scholarship have a purifying urgency that is rare in this world. This puts him at the very source of theology and enables him to say new things in timeless language so that the reader's surprise and assent are one and the same. He's a Guggenheim Fellow, holds 2 honorary doctorates, and his interests include modern poetry, the language of faith, accidental theology, that is, theology conducted by unexpected means, and what it means to be a Christian intellectual in a secular culture. Christian Wiman, welcome to Conversing. Thank you so much for being a guest with us today.
Thanks for having me, Mark.
Your work has been very profound and very profoundly affecting me for years. And I do really particularly consider it an honor and a gift to be able to have this conversation. For those very reasons, it's also complicated to have the conversation because I find at least the discussion of poetry and with a poet a rich and intimidating conversation because of the very nature of language. So I just feel like I need to admit that from the start because it's not as easily negotiable as people who only do prose, which you also do. But poetry is another matter. I think
we'll make it easy.
Yes, good. I would like you to start by just telling people maybe a bit about your biographical background, really, let's just say in the last 15 years. Just give people a shape of the major events, including your diagnosis and your cancer, and then other things that you may want to add as well.
Well, I have to go back 21 years. That's when I took over poetry. I moved to Chicago and then to take a job at Northwestern, and then I very quickly became the editor of Poetry Magazine there in Chicago. And it's the oldest magazine devoted to poetry in the English-speaking world and the largest. And they had just gotten a huge grant of $200 million from the philanthropist Ruth Lilly. And so everything was in a state of great turmoil. And I took that over with really no experience. It was just sort of at the right place at the right time, and met my wife at the same time and fell in love with her. And we got married shortly after. And then I was diagnosed with an incurable cancer before we'd been married for a year. And so that's basically defined my last 20 years. I've had 13 treatments and it's just never gone away. But I've, had periods of remission, and I edited poetry for 10 years, and then I wanted to change my life, and I happened to do a lecture at Yale Divinity School, and when I liked it so much, and I liked the students so much, that when I got back, I wrote them a letter and said that they should consider hiring a poet.
Nice.
Which was it was a pretty bold thing to do. I have no graduate training at all, much less in theology, but I was writing a lot about theological things, and to my great surprise, they responded, and it wasn't quite that easy. But after a while, I came to Yale Divinity School to teach, and that's been 12 years now, 13 years, something like that. And so we've been here ever since. My wife directs the undergraduate creative writing major in the English department. So we're both working at Yale now.
Right. And what is the status currently of your cancer? Are you in remission at the moment, or is it actively progressing?
Yeah, I had a clinical trial a couple of years ago, and I was really dead on the table, but I got into this clinical trial and was the first person with my disease to have this treatment, and it worked.
Wow.
Yeah. So I guess that's been 3 years now. So I've been 3 years in good health.
And 3 years that you would have imagined you might not have ever had.
Right. Yeah. No, I definitely thought it was over.
Yeah. Yeah. It seems right that we should begin with one of your poems. And I'd like to invite you to read Every Riven Thing.
So this poem figures into all that I said, because when I took the job at Poetry Magazine, I had not written a poem in almost 3 years, and it had just gone dead for me. And I was still writing prose. I've always been able to continue writing prose, but I couldn't write a poem. And shortly after my diagnosis, my wife and I had begun saying prayers before I got diagnosed. And though we had both been away from Christianity for a long time, and we said them half jokingly before dinner, and then they became more serious. And then after I got diagnosed, we decided one morning to go to this church, which was down at the end of the street. And it was the United Church of Christ. And I'd never even heard of it. I'd only heard of Church of Christ. That's what we had where I grew up. But it was at the corner of the street. It was a church. So we went. And it turned out to be quite an amazing place. Very small, about 40 people, but 40 people who desperately needed to be there. And a young minister who was on fire with what he had to bring to them. He has become one of my closest friends. And I came home from that first service and wrote a poem. And this is the poem, Every Riven Thing. And it's a complicated formal poem, which I wrote in about less than an hour. And it uses, the first line is, God goes, belonging to every riven thing he's made. And then each stanza changes the punctuation of that line so that the meaning changes. I invented the form just on the spot. God goes, belonging to every riven thing he's made, sing his being simply by being the thing it is. Stone and tree and sky, man who sees and sings and wonders why God goes. Belonging to every riven thing he's made means a storm of peace. Think of the atoms inside the stone. Think of the man who sits alone, trying to will himself into a stillness where God goes, belonging. To every riven thing he's made, there is given one shade, shaped exactly to the thing itself. Under the tree, a darker tree. Under the man, the only man to see, God goes, belonging to every riven thing. He's made the things that bring him near, made the mind that makes him go, a part of what man knows, apart from what man knows. God goes, belonging to every riven thing he's made.
When you had finished writing that, do you remember your sense of the experience and why suddenly out of this worship service, such a beautiful and remarkable poem really suddenly was available?
Well, the worship service was a mixture of joy and suffering together, fused. I mean, it was great joy, but it just seemed to rip us both open. And the poem was the same way. The poem felt like an incredible gift, and I was just ecstatic, but it was also fraught with sorrow. I mean, lit with sorrow. You know, the poem is ambivalent in its relation with God. I mean, God is a part of what man knows, but apart from what man knows. Both those things.
Both those things. At one stage in your writing, you make the comment that poetry is in part about compression and paradox that come together in language. this poem feels to me like exactly a distillation of those two qualities. There's this incredible condensation, in part through the form that you invented and in part through the actual words that you use, but also this sense of paradox about what you just said, the sense of being a part of and also apart from. And I'm just curious if you would comment on that.
Yeah, I think our experiences like that, our deepest experiences are paradoxical in that way. And I think what poetry gives us are the experiences themselves, not a description of an experience and not a record of an experience, but an experience itself, which is why there's some level at which a great poem is irreducible. Like criticism can help. You can give you insight into the poem, but it's always reductive. You're not going to get that experience of the poem. The closest you can come is by memorizing it, which is why all my students have to memorize poems.
Right. Do you have, I know you have many poems memorized, but could you share one that has been particularly poignant to you, either your own or someone else's, that you would just like to share with us?
Oh, well, I immediately think of a little George Herbert is a great poet that's been very important to me. And
Me too.
he has a short little poem called Bittersweet. Ah, my dear angry Lord, since thou dost love, yet strike, cast down, yet help afford, sure I will do the like. I will complain, yet praise. I will bewail, approve, and all my sour, sweet days I will lament and love. That's basically the same thing.
It is.
All my sour, sweet days I will lament and love, both those at the same time.
I think that's when poetry has always been the most powerful to me. And it's the heart of the reason why George Herbert's poetry has been so significant to me over the decades, because he holds these tensions together in such a authentic way that calls to my longing for authenticity of a similar kind. And when I read your poetry, I do experience many of those same kind of instincts and compulsions, the attractions of the intensity of your raw experience in the words, as well as in the reference by the words to the experiences that you've had. Every Riven Thing poem is an example of that, and certainly that George Herbert poem is another instance of that. I think it's this intensity of collision, but also distance. So a lot of your poetry and some of your writing is about the tension between absence and presence. I wonder if you could just comment on those themes in your work, because they're prominent, not least as you face, as we all must, the reality of death, but other kinds of absences and losses as well.
Well, when I was in my 20s, I read at the same time the Simone Weil's Gravity and Grace and Marilyn Robinson's novel Housekeeping. And I was probably 21, 22. And I read both those books hard on the heels of each other. And they, in some ways, both those books defined my life, because they gave me a language for what I was feeling, which this volatile absence, which could either destroy me or save me. And both of them gave me a language for it to become a means of salvation rather than destruction. I can't claim to have reconciled that over the course of my life or gotten, become at peace with it. But I do think that part of any mature faith is learning to be in God's absence without fighting it. Any irritable reaching after facts and reason, as the poet Keats put it in a different context. And so both those things, absence and the absence of God and the presence of God, have been extremely powerful elements in my life. The presence of God, less so. I experience the absence more than the presence. Simone Weil would say that that's just the way that that's what the nature of being human is. That on this side of the grave, we experience the distance of God, and we would be annihilated otherwise.
So that it's actually the necessity, not the accident, as it were.
Yeah.
When I first read My Bride Abyss, which is subtitled Meditation of a Modern Believer, I was completely drawn into it. And partly because I've had the experience and gift and challenge of being a pastor for more than 40 years, and having been so many, many, many hundreds of times near and with people who are dying and people who are facing dying experiences and who are in various places in every dimension of life. So what they bring to that moment, it's been largely my experience that people, unless they have a personality changing disease, people tend to die the way they've lived. And it was a gift to me when I read My Bride Abyss to feel just drawn in, as I so often have with other people's stories, about the way that they give language and experience expression to this very distinct human reality of death, not distinct in the sense that it's unique in the universe, but distinct to each person who goes through it. And some of the chapters in My Bride Abyss that have meant the most to me, one is the chapter that you call God's Truth is Life. And I wonder if you could read a couple of things there. I think the first thing might be the poem From a Window.
Okay, this is a poem that about someone sitting at the window and just in dire straits. You don't know what the situation of the speaker is. I didn't have this experience. And seeing what looks just like a plain tree suddenly explode into birds. That's the description that's in the poem. Incurable and unbelieving in any truth but the truth of grieving, I saw a tree inside a tree rise kaleidoscopically as if the leaves had livelier ghosts. I pressed my face as close to the pain as I could get to watch that fitful, fluent spirit that seemed a single being, undefined, or countless beings of one mind, haul its strange cohesion beyond the limits of my vision, over the house, heavenwards. Of course I knew those leaves were birds. Of course that old tree stood exactly as it had and would, but why should it seem fuller now? And though a man's mind might endow even a tree with some excess of life to which a man seems witness, that life is not the life of men. And that is where the joy came in. This poem was a great revelation to me because it began in complete grief, incurable and unbelieving in any truth but the truth of grieving, which for a long time it seemed to me that the expression of suffering was more authentic than any other kind of expression. And then the poem just exploded into joy. And it wasn't me doing it. It just happened. And I remember the shock of it afterwards. And it was writing this poem and the earlier poem that I read and some poems in between that really began to make me think of what might be asked of a person after they make art. Like I know a lot of artists whose work seems to me entirely separate from their lives. They'll make some art that is transcendent and gives you some sort of rapturous experience of reality. But then on the other side of the art, they'll say they don't believe in transcendence. They don't believe in any kind of otherness to reality. They don't even believe in the soul. I even know poets who say they don't believe in the soul. And I just think that's a willful blindness which I had for a long time. I think the work was showing me a different dimension to existence, and I just would not see it. I would not let go of my despair, even though the poems were showing me something else. And so that's the way a poem can be a great event and instruction in the life of an artist. You know, it can be that in the reader too, for sure, but sometimes it can be that in the life of an artist.
Right. It is interesting to me, again, as a pastor, how much experience I've had where grief, more than almost any other emotion, can become so defining that it really does exclude or appear to exclude so much else about reality as a way of consuming a person. Is that a way of reflecting back what you've said in this poem at the beginning, and then the way that that shock from that, I would call it enclosed space of grief, ends up becoming fractured by this incredible kaleidoscopic tree?
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think we are often, not often, but we are all occasionally visited by these moments of transport, usually with nature, but not necessarily. Other people can be with machinery, can be with, I've had it on a train. I wrote a poem about a train where I had that experience once, and we don't know what to do with them, and I think there's an essay that Zadie Smith once wrote on joy, and she was distinguishing between joy and pleasure. And she said that she'd had probably 6 moments of, I think it was 6 moments of true joy in her life, the kind of really destabilizing joy that C.S. Lewis attributed his conversion to 3 of those moments when he was young. And she said if an angel came down and offered her another one, she might say no. She was a person of great pleasure, and she relished pleasure, but she found the moments of joy too destabilizing, too difficult. And I remember thinking when I read that essay, well, I know what that is, because joy asks something of us on the other side. And it can be compassion. That's what Jürgen Moltmann said, that compassion is the other side of a living joy. It can be a reevaluation of your own life, the lives of the people around you, be all kinds of things, but it asks something of us. And yeah, those moments are fugitive, but very powerful. As when I think of what faith means, I sometimes use the line from Abraham Joshua Heschel that faith is mostly faithfulness to the times when we had faith. And if you look at what those moments are moments of union with reality so intense that you don't need the word faith. They don't need to have a meaning. They are. It's afterward you find yourself searching.
I love your admiration of Heschel and share it, and have found often his language, typically in prose, of course, just lands poetically in my own experience and life. Part of it, I think the reason why his books have been so powerful in their influence on people, certainly on me.
He's so clear too. He's just
so clear, yes. So clear. Even when he knows and is very self-conscious, of course, of handling unspeakable mysteries, he's still clear. It's an amazing kind of combination.
That's why C.S. Lewis survives too, because he is treating matters of great complexity, but with such clarity.
Yes. What is it that Lewis or Heschel are doing that allows that clarity, do you think?
Well, honestly, I think it's genius. And I think it's something very particular to their minds, because there are other great writers that I've learned a great deal from that simply don't have that clarity. And it's pretty rare. Even like Marilyn Robinson, she's a very great writer, and she can be very clear in her fiction, but her nonfiction is not clear. No one would argue that it's transparent, but she is a very great writer. So I think minds can just work differently. But I think in those instances, it is some great capacity for marrying reason and imagination, because both of them use metaphors so often, but both of them have such powers of reason that you're just sort of astonished at the power of mind.
And such a stockpile of deep reading and reflection that allows that nimbleness, I think, to just flow so beautifully. One of Lewis's greatest talents, I think, is his ability to take that clarity and metaphor and take us into places where he then suddenly flips it, and it becomes even more illuminating because of the thing to which he points. I think, for example, of the end of or that moment in his sermon, The Weight of Glory, about his phrase, "Our Lord finds our desires not too strong, but too weak. We're like half-hearted creatures who fool about with sex and drink and ambition when infinite joy is offered us. We're like children who would rather go on making mud pies in a slum because we can't imagine what's meant by the offer of a holiday at the sea." That
Mm.
that pivot that Lewis does there is classic to me of his mind and of his understanding of God and of his holding mystery with clarity.
Yeah. And what he does in The Great Divorce, I find just so amazing. It makes all those characters he makes the afterlife seem at once completely imaginary. He's inventing this thing, and yet completely real, because you feel your own anxieties and deficiencies played out in these characters. And I really find that book very powerful every time I read it.
Right, right. It is very powerful. I wonder, one of the most recent books that you have written, of course, is the letters that you and Miroslav Volf have written together in the book entitled Glimmerings, Letters on Faith Between a Poet and a Theologian. It's an amazing set of letters, and I think anybody who reads it will benefit enormously from hearing the echoes and deep reflections of both of your spirits and your own connectedness with one another. Friendship is one of the main themes in many ways that I experienced in reading the book. It felt like here are two people that are both knowledgeable of one another and also still learning from and about each other, even as strong as your relationship is. I'd like people to have a flavor of that, and I wonder if you could read some paragraphs that start on page 225. And I'd like you to start with the paragraph that begins, "I love the idea of after angels."
Okay, yeah. Miroslav in the previous letter had mentioned the idea of after angel. I don't know if he used that expression, but of recognizing that he'd been accompanied retrospectively, which is like Heschel's idea of remaining faithful to those moments when we had faith. I love the idea of after angels, those presences we become aware of only retrospectively. Didn't our hearts burn within us? The disciples wonder on their way to Emmaus after Jesus has revealed himself to them and vanished in the light of their understanding, which is just the plain old everyday light of life. And in fact, I have my own recent retroactive angel, and you were there. The other day when we were walking around the expensive spring gleaming blocks north of the Div School, and I was trying to tell you without really telling you why I was finding the essay I was writing on Seamus Heaney and American poetry so painful and destabilizing, you asked me, very gently, the tone changed, if I could explain why. And rather than resort to professional deflections as I would usually do, I found myself. That's what it felt like, both surprising and revelatory. I found myself speaking the truth. The essay had brought me face to face with my own work and life, the ambitions I had when I was young and the reality of my 57-year-old circumstances, and the clarity of the perception I have fallen short hurt. I wasn't sleeping well. I was picking up my own books and thumbing through them like essential instruction manuals in a language I couldn't read. I was drowning in despair. Absurdly and preposterously, yes, as the water was about an inch deep. But to an infant, and suddenly that's what I seemed to be, even a puddle can prove fatal. We stopped on the street, and rather than offer consolation or disputing my assessment of the situation, you simply admitted to sometimes feeling the same thing. And suddenly I felt, I don't know, released. The feeling wasn't gone. The recrimination still seethed and roiled in my soul like those little blurps of air in cooking oatmeal. I still felt the cold undertow of oblivion, but I also felt lightened, alive in the spring-gleaming streets, myself, and glad for that. Why? Nothing had changed. I can only think that the act of two bare, forked creatures acknowledging their bare, forked creatureliness enabled Christ to come among them, in them and between them. I carried the moment with me for days. I carry it now.
Just find that section particularly moving, and it's moving because it's an incident in which two human beings have a kind of communion which we long for, ache for. It's simple in a way. It's actually the unspokenness of the moment as well as the spokenness of the moment that it seems to me made it have such poignancy. And it is transformative in the way that you're describing. That sense of hope comes in these small fracture lines where suddenly a simple word, a plain question, a presence, a pause on the street, a willingness to actually let each other's life and being in all of its particularity get weighed with the seriousness that it deserves. Those are some of the things that strike me about this. Can you elaborate any more about how this kind of experience, which it seems to me is part of some of the poetry we've already read this morning, the same kind of surprise moment where suddenly there is a line of grace that appears in an unexpected way?
Yeah, I mean, I'm always moved to think of the line of Dietrich Bonhoeffer's letters where he said, Christ is always stronger in our brother's heart than in our own. And I think that's what that moment was, that for me, I could see Christ reflected back at me in his response. And it was a powerful moment. I mean, Miroslav is a great man. He's not just a great theologian. He's a great theologian because he's a great man. And he's capable of great compassion and insight. And there's so many ways that moment could have gone wrong. Like I say in there, to reassure me that, oh no, you've done this. He didn't say anything like that.
Right, right, right.
And I mean, he said exactly the right thing. And it really was completely, when I think about it, it really had nothing to do with what I was worried about, like inner accomplishment or anything like that. The relief came from the communion between people. It was entirely apart from everything else I was worried about. It was the ease to everything I was worried about. And that's often the case in life, that our anxieties, the cure for them is other than what we think.
Right. It reminds me, I suppose, of Emily Dickinson's line, "Tell the truth, but tell it slant." The slantness of truth is, and the slantness of the communication of truth, which is at least one way of defining poetry in my mind, is the opportunity to be able to experience and receive these unexpected angularities that actually end up being right on target, even though they come in surprising ways.
Yeah. The truth must dazzle gradually, or every man be blind. Is how
Yes. Yes, exactly. Yeah. Which is a statement of mystery. Ultimately, I would say a statement about worship, but it's a statement certainly about the character of radical truth, including divine truth.
Yeah.
I'm curious, when you think about your relationship with Miroslav at a time when it's so commonly being written about the friendless American male and the percentage of people over certain ages that have almost no close friends, where something like 40% of the male population over 60 would claim that the only close friend they have may have been their spouse, who may or may not yet still be alive, and therefore they are left really without a friend. In this context, and in other writings that you've done, but here you're talking to Miroslav in part about your friendship. Give us a sense of the granularity of how that friendship between you and Miroslav merged. I can imagine it, but I'd love to hear you express it more.
Well, we met right when I got to Yale because his wife, Jessica, took the very first class I taught. She audited the class that I taught. And so through her, she's a very brilliant person. And through her, I got to know Miroslav. And the four of us started getting together. That became more difficult as our kids got a little older, and Miroslav and I started meeting on our own. And at first we would meet for meals, but then I don't remember how the walks started, but we just decided to take walks instead. Neither of us really sat down for lunch. So that was made more sense for us to walk. And so we started taking these walks together, and we would walk for a solid hour fast and just talk the whole time. And, we would catch up with each other, but there was a lot of theology because, that's his passion and it's a passion of mine. I'm very interested in theology, and constantly sort of floundering because I'm not trained in it, and I don't have the mind for it really. I don't remember things, and I don't think abstractly all that well. But he really didn't read much poetry, and so that was a new experience for him. And then that just went on for years, and then in the times we would fall out of touch when I was sick, or he travels a lot, way more than I would ever want to. But this last time I was sick, and we had an email exchange, and I was really sick. I couldn't really get out of bed for, most of a year.
Mm.
And the email exchange was just this very brief thing about taking care of I can't remember what details we were taking care of. But then we had a brief exchange about what it meant to love God. Or I made kind of a flippant comment, and then he wrote back trying to respond. And then that occasioned an exchange. And then after that, we got together and talked about what if we realized that something had really been energized in us, and what if we made this a project, and we tried to articulate to each other what faith means to us at the moment. And the only rule was that it can't be a burden, that if you don't feel like writing, you don't have to, and it can't be just something we're adding on to our lives and some difficulty. And so, for about 18 months, we exchanged these emails to each other. And it was a great gift. It was really a great gift because it really deepened our friendship, because you say things in a letter that you wouldn't say in person. And you can have much sharper disagreements. You can flesh it out. That was a big part of my youth. In my 20s and 30s, I had long correspondences with friends about art and poetry and all kinds of things. That was a big part of my writing life, which ended with email. And so it was a familiar thing to me, but it was quite a gift to have it given back like that.
Right. Have you continued that correspondence, even though the project itself?
No, that was the end of it.
Yes.
That was the end.
Right.
Now we're back to walking.
Good. So what happens in light of the harvest of such a conversation on email to the embodied relationship when you're still doing your walking? How do the two things connect or disconnect?
Oh, I think it's really deepened it. Yeah, I think it's really deepened it. And it revealed a level of trust that we have for each other that has deepened the relationship. Yeah.
Right. One of the images in the Psalms that I've always loved is the repeated use of the image that the Lord has brought us into a broad place. And when I was reading this, it felt to me like I didn't have that actively in my mind, but my experience of the quality of the conversation you were having was not broad in the sense of obviously shallow. There's nothing about it that's the slightest bit shallow, but broad in the sense of allowing the borders or the boundaries or any constraints to just be allowed to be completely and presently brought forward into this broad place where everything that you would want to have shared with one another in light of the topics you were discussing and so forth was able to find acceptance, receptivity, readiness to receive the gift. It was more like that sort of vibrant improv where it's never but it's always and, even in the places where you were perhaps having disagreements with one another, which happens obviously throughout the book in different ways.
Yeah. And we did a podcast shortly after the book came out, and I don't know why this came as such a surprise to me, but it's everywhere in the letters if you think about it. But he said that he was envious of my hunger for God because he didn't feel that kind of hunger that I have felt all my life. And I am envious of his calm, placid relationship with God, his trust that God is always there. And I think that was quite a shock to me to realize that we were each envying what the other had.
Right. Isn't that all too common? I'm curious, maybe this is where we might end our conversation. We haven't spoken to the fact that you came to Yale from, I'll call it the broadlands of Texas. And when I read your poetry and feel your voracious hunger for God, I find myself often holding that and hearing that as something that's arising out of this vast expanse of what, to my Northwestern eyes, having grown up around trees and mountains, not flatlands and dust as much, it makes me wonder about this hunger. And because some people listening to this may not have yet encountered your work, although I hope many will do so after this, talk to us about how that hunger for God comes and goes, rises and falls, tyrannizes and comforts. That's impossible to actually capture in a brief comment or two, but just get people started on what that journey for you has meant.
Well, when I think of my home, I've lived here in Connecticut longer than I've lived anywhere in my life in this one house. But the only place that I think of as home is West Texas, that little town of Snyder, where we moved when I was 8, I think. And it's that vast expanse that is at once wide open and annihilating, crushing. A lot of the women in particular went mad when the men had things to do. The women were left in these houses, and when they moved from Europe or the East or to the Midwest, and everything was just flat, but it drove them crazy. And there is an element of madness in that, in my vision of that place, that there was in my family. No doubt that's part of it. People used to be very surprised to hear that I'd grown up in a place like that, because I grew up in a place without books, and I'd never didn't even know what poetry was until I went to college. But I do think that there was a tactile quality to experience. Seamus Heaney, the Irish poet, has a great poem about his father made a harvest bow when he was a kid, and Heaney has that as looking at it in this poem, and he says, "Oh, over again I tell and finger it like braille, gleaning the unsaid off the palpable." Gleaning the unsaid off the palpable. Beautiful lines. And I grew up, I think, gleaning the unsaid off the palpable, and it was good training in that way. I have wondered if the hunger that I have for God is simply a malignant seed that was planted in me at that time. If I'd grown up in a different environment, would I be more at peace? Would I, I don't know. Doubt it. But I'm much taken with Paul Ricoeur's, speaking of someone who writes very profoundly about faith, but not very clearly. But he did say that he thought of his own life as a Christian was chance, an element of chance turned into a destiny by virtue of a constant choice. And I think that's a pretty great description. There's an element of chance in all of our lives. Where we grow up does determine the language we use and the language of faith we use. And it becomes a destiny by virtue of a constant choice. You have to use the language you've got, and in order to get any depth. And so I value that in I have a very conflicted relationship with my past because it was difficult, but I do value a lot that I learned and was taught and saw in that place. And it's everywhere in my writing, obviously.
Right. It does permeate things. I have wondered at times if you know the work of Kathleen Norris, whose experience of inheriting, a house in the Dakotas, thinking this is going to be the end of my literary life. And then it turns out that it's the birthplace of her literary life. And while that may not be the way you would put it, certainly the richness of the way you have harvested that, experienced and given language to that is really remarkable. And I do think the hunger that you're describing for God, as torturous as it is at times, as deeply pained as it is represented in your writing and particularly in your poetry, is something that is part of why people across an enormously broad spectrum of readers has found such a home in your language, because I think there's so many people who feel a hunger for God who don't necessarily find that they have sufficient language to describe it, and your words have been part of the gift that they've received from reading you.
It's one of the great things that poems can give us, that, I have gotten it myself more from other people's poetry than my own.
Yes, yes.
And I still am greatly consoled and held up by the work of others.
I think one of the things that I wanted to say to you personally is that, having studied poetry a lot over the course of my life and having had a vocation which keeps me in poetry, not least biblical poetry, but many other kinds of poetry, I still find reading poetry to be both one of the most important parts of my life and one of the things that I rather studiously avoid for long periods of time in various seasons. And it's partly because it in the flat dimensional world, a horizontal world of the way that so many things are experienced now, I'm aware that is an easier plane to live on, whereas poetry is going to take me to a place that I'm going to have to feel and think and respond in the complexity that I am, and in the complexity that the world is, and in the complexity and beauty that God is. And so your poetry has been in many ways a re-entry for me into reading poetry, yours and others, more than I think I would otherwise be doing right now in my life. And it reminds me again, and tyrannizes me at the same time, of all that invitation holds. So I thank you for all of those different dimensions and for the awakening that reading your poetry is for me.
Oh, well, thank you for saying that. It's nice. I've done a couple of anthologies, three anthologies, one on Poetry Magazine, their 100 years, and then one on Joy and one on Home. And those are filled with poems that I've found to be a great help in my own spiritual life, all of them.
Yes. Thank you so much, Christian, for being with us today and for the privilege of this conversation and for your ongoing honesty in the world and before God and before your readers.
Thanks for having me, Mark. It's been a joy.
Conversing is produced and distributed in partnership with Comment Magazine and Fuller Seminary. Peter Labberton is our engineer and editor. Evan Rosa is our producer. For more information about Comment Magazine, visit comment.org, where you can subscribe, read the current magazine issue, and browse their archive. Fuller Seminary is an evangelical, multi-denominational graduate institution committed to providing indispensable formational education for diverse Christian leaders everywhere. For information, visit fuller.edu. I'm your host, Mark Labberton. Thanks for listening with me.